The Isanz River, lost among the hills of eastern Poland, became a witness to one of the bloodiest and least known battles of World War II. In 1943, two irreconcilable forces clashed here. German units desperately holding the Eastern Front and Soviet troops relentlessly advancing westward. The battle, which claimed thousands of lives, remained but a shadow in the annals of military history, overshadowed by large-scale operations at Stalingrad and Kursk. Polish soil, transformed into an arena of a foreign war, preserves the memory of those terrible days in nameless graves and ruined villages. The historical significance of this battle was deliberately downplayed in post-war Soviet chronicles and Western studies. For Germany, it was a painful defeat that they preferred not to remember. For the Soviet Union, it was merely an intermediate episode in the general offensive. For Poland, however, the battle on the Isanz became a symbol of national tragedy, when the fates of other nations were decided on its land and its own children became innocent victims. Poland in 1939 was a state caught in the epicenter of a geopolitical hurricane. The interwar 20 years of independence ended tragically for the country. On September 1st, German troops invaded from the west, and on September 17th, Soviet troops invaded from the east. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23rd, predetermined the fate of the Polish state, dividing it between two totalitarian regimes. By the time of the Battle of Isanz in 1943, Poland had already been under occupation for 4 years. The Western territories were directly incorporated into the Third Reich, while the central regions became the so-called General Government, a colonial entity under German administration. The eastern lands became part of the Soviet Union as parts of the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian SSRs. For Germany, Polish territory represented a vitally important strategic bridgehead. Large industrial facilities were located here, especially in Silesia, which supplied the German war machine. Agricultural areas became a source of food. Furthermore, key transport arteries connecting Germany with the Eastern Front passed through Poland. For the Soviet Union, the return of Polish lands had not only military, but also ideological significance. This was the first step towards restoring control over territories lost after the revolution. Moreover, the advance westward meant approaching Germany's borders and the possibility of carrying the war into enemy territory. The local population found itself between a hammer and an anvil. Nazi policy towards Poles aimed at turning them into forced labor and the gradual extermination of the intelligentsia and elite. The Soviet occupation of the eastern territories was accompanied by mass deportations and repressions against class alien elements. By the beginning of 1943, the situation on the fronts had changed dramatically. After the defeat at Stalingrad, German troops began to retreat. The Red Army, on the contrary, seized the strategic initiative and moved westward. Poland once again found itself in the epicenter of military confrontation, now as a battlefield between the retreating Wehrmacht and the advancing Red Army. It was in these circumstances that the Isanka River acquired strategic importance. Flowing from north to south, it created a natural defensive line that the German command sought to use to slow down the Soviet offensive. Control over the crossings across the Isanka allowed for holding significant territories and protecting important transport hubs. The Isanka River, a small tributary of the Vistula, just over 30 kilometers long, usually didn't attract much attention. But in the summer of 1943, this modest waterway became the front line of confrontation between two of the world's greatest armies. The Isanka flows from northwest to southeast, forming a picturesque valley amidst rolling hills. In its upper reaches, the river is shallow and narrow, only 15 to 20 meters wide, making it easily fordable. However, in its middle and lower sections, the Isanz widens to 50 meters and in places forms marshy areas, becoming a serious obstacle for heavy equipment. The western bank is high and steep, with commanding heights, ideally suited for defensive positions. The eastern bank is more gentle, open, with extensive fields, which made attacking units vulnerable to artillery fire. The German command masterfully utilized these landscape features. Multi-tiered firing positions were established on the western bank, and artillery was placed on the heights, ensuring control over the entire valley. 3 bridge crossings, near the villages of Vysoko, Sredny Brod, and Nizhny Luki, were mined but not destroyed, to preserve the possibility of counterattacks. The Soviet command faced a serious dilemma. A frontal crossing of the river threatened enormous casualties, while outflanking from the north or south required time and significant resources. It was decided to conduct a diversionary maneuver in the area of Vysoko village, where the river forms a bend, and to deliver the main blow in the southern sector near Nizhny Luki. The forests surrounding the Isanz, predominantly mixed, with a predominance of pine and oak, played a dual role. On the one hand, they provided cover for maneuvering units. On the other hand, they complicated coordination of actions and adjustment of artillery fire. Particularly dense forest areas were located in the northwestern sector, where the Germans had created an extensive network of abattis and minefields. 3 key settlements determined the strategic value of this area. The town of Isanz, an administrative center with a railway station, was located 5 kilometers west of the river. It was traversed by a crucial transport artery connecting Army Group Center with rear supply bases. Vysokoye village controlled the northern bridge and a crossroads of highways. Nizhny Luki, the southernmost settlement in the combat zone, had strategic importance due to its proximity to a railway branch line. The weather conditions of July 1943 made their own adjustments to the plans of both sides. Prolonged rains raised the water level in the Isanz by almost a meter, making many fords impassable. Marshy areas turned into real quagmires insurmountable for tanks. At the same time, high cloud cover hampered aviation operations, depriving the Germans of an important advantage in the air. The Soviet command, analyzing the terrain features, made an unconventional decision. Instead of a traditional massive offensive, it was decided to conduct a series of night raids by small groups, with the aim of capturing bridgeheads on the western bank. For this purpose, special assault detachments were formed from experienced fighters familiar with water obstacles. German strategists, anticipating the possibility of such actions, created a deeply echeloned defense. The first line ran directly along the bank, the second 200 to 300 meters from the river on the heights. The third line relied on settlements, turned into fortified strongholds of resistance. Special attention was paid to night observation. The bank was illuminated by flares, and searchlights were installed at critical points. By July 1943, a tense military situation had developed along the banks of the Isanz. The German command, recognizing the strategic importance of this frontier, had concentrated significant forces here. The core of the defensive grouping consisted of the 226th Wehrmacht Infantry Division, reinforced by a battalion of heavy Tiger tanks and 2 divisions of Ferdinand self-propelled artillery units. The total strength of the German grouping reached 22,000 men, with 120 tanks and self-propelled guns and 250 artillery pieces of various calibers. This group was commanded by Lieutenant General Hans Dorn, a veteran of World War I and the Eastern Campaign, known for his meticulous approach to organizing defenses. They were opposed by the 47th Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Fyodor Zakharov, which numbered approximately 35,000 soldiers. The Soviet forces were armed with 180 tanks, predominantly T-34s, 300 artillery pieces, and Katyusha rocket launchers. Air cover was provided by a fighter aviation regiment, equipped with the then-latest Yak-9 aircraft. By this time, German units already had extensive experience in defensive operations. Many officers and soldiers had passed through the crucible of the Battle of Stalingrad, which allowed them to develop effective tactical techniques. The defense was built on the principle of a flexible echeloned system with the ability to quickly transfer reserves to threatened sectors. Every height, every copse was turned into a strongpoint with overlapping fields of fire. Particular attention was paid to anti-tank defense. Minefields were laid, and anti-tank guns concentrated along possible routes of tank attacks. The morale of the German troops was mixed. Veterans who had experienced the retreat from Stalingrad understood the gravity of the situation. Young recruits arriving from Germany still retained their fighting spirit and belief in ultimate victory. The officer corps demonstrated high professionalism, but in private conversations, doubts about the possibility of holding the Eastern Front were increasingly voiced. Soviet troops, on the contrary, were on the rise. The successes at Stalingrad and Kursk instilled confidence in an imminent and decisive turning point in the war. Many soldiers had personal scores to settle with the enemy. Lost homes, deceased relatives intensified their motivation. At the same time, the command understood that the upcoming forced crossing of the water barrier would be a complex operation requiring meticulous preparation. The strategic objectives of the sides differed significantly. The German command sought to hold the line along the Isanka River at all costs, gaining time for the regrouping of main forces and the creation of a stronger defensive line further west. Every day of delay in the Soviet offensive counted. An additional task was to maintain control over the Isanz railway junction, through which the entire eastern flank was supplied. The Soviet command set itself an ambitious goal, not just to force a crossing of the water barrier, but also to develop the offensive, encircling and destroying the German grouping. The capture of bridgeheads on the western bank was to become a springboard for further westward advance. Intelligence played a special role. Both sides actively used aerial photographic reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, and agent network data. The Germans had an advantage in knowledge of the terrain. Many maps of the Soviet command contained inaccuracies, which subsequently led to tactical miscalculations. On the night before the battle began, there was tense anticipation in the positions. German engineering units hastily fortified defensive structures and mined approaches to the river. Soviet sappers prepared crossing equipment and studied possible fords. Artillerymen on both sides zeroed in on landmarks, preparing for the upcoming artillery duel. The fate of thousands of people and control over a strategically important region were to be decided in the coming days. The dawn of July 15, 1943, was foggy and cold. The silence, hanging over the Isanz Valley, was broken only by the muffled hum of Soviet reconnaissance aircraft patrolling the pre-dawn sky. At 4 in the morning, the silence was shattered by the roar of artillery. A massive Soviet artillery barrage had begun. Hundreds of shells rained down on German positions, exploding the earth, plowing up trenches, destroying observation posts. Lieutenant General Zakharov began the operation with a classic maneuver, a diversionary strike on the northern sector, near the village of Vysokoye. Assault groups of the 42nd Rifle Division, under the cover of artillery fire, launched dozens of boats and rafts. The first wave of attackers, overcoming the swift current, gained a foothold on the western bank, but came under heavy machine gun fire. Of the 80 soldiers in the first assault group, only 37 reached the opposite bank. General Dorn had anticipated such a development. The main forces of the German defense had been withdrawn to the second line in advance, and the forward positions were occupied only by observers and machine gun crews. When Soviet artillery shifted its fire deeper into the defense, masked German batteries came into action, opening fire on the crossings. By noon, the situation for Soviet troops in the northern sector had become critical. The bridgehead, captured at great cost, was cut off from the main forces. Ammunition was running out, and evacuating the wounded was impossible. Battalion Commander Major Kovalyov decided to entrench in the coastal thickets and repel enemy counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, near Nizhny Luki, the main Soviet offensive was unfolding. Engineer units, under the cover of night, built pontoon bridges, camouflaging them with branches and nets. At dawn, a tank regiment began crossing. The first 10 vehicles successfully crossed the river, but then German aviation discovered the crossing. Junkers 87s dropped their bomb loads on the pontoons, destroying the central section of the bridge. 3 tanks, which were on the crossing at that moment, went underwater along with their crews. In the middle of the day, the weather changed sharply. A torrential rain began, turning the coastal lowlands into swamps. This complicated the actions of both sides, but especially the German tank reserves, which got bogged down in the sodden soil. The Soviet command took advantage of the situation. Fresh infantry forces were thrown into the breach, forcing the river on makeshift means. By the evening of the first day of battle, a stalemate had developed. Soviet troops had established themselves on 2 small bridgeheads on the western bank, but were unable to develop the success. The German defense, having suffered significant losses, maintained its integrity and control over key heights. Both sides used the approaching night to regroup and bring up reserves. The dawn of the next day was marked by a new Soviet offensive, now in the central sector. Assault groups, reinforced by sappers under the cover of a smokescreen, forced the river and attacked the strongpoint near Sredny Broad. A fierce battle ensued, in which both sides suffered heavy losses. By noon, the German garrison was forced to retreat, leaving the strategically important height 123. The first days of the battle revealed miscalculations on both sides. The Soviet command underestimated the depth of the German defense and the strength of the artillery positions on the western bank. The Germans, in turn, dispersed their reserves, trying to close all directions of possible breakthrough, which weakened their capabilities for decisive counterattacks. The Battle of Isanz became a true laboratory of tactical innovations, where both sides were forced to adapt their strategies to the complex terrain and changing circumstances. The third day of the battle brought fundamental changes to the nature of the fighting. The German command, realizing the inefficiency of static defense, switched to the concept of elastic defense, a tactic first tested during the First World War. The basis of this approach was the creation of mobile combat groups, capable of quickly moving along the front line and launching counterattacks against breakthrough Soviet units. Each such group included infantry in armored personnel carriers, 2 or 3 tanks, and an anti-tank gun. These mobile formations, moving along pre-prepared routes, could appear in threatened areas in a matter of minutes, creating the impression among the enemy that there were many more German forces than there actually were. The Soviet command responded with its own tactical innovation. Instead of massive frontal attacks, which led to heavy losses, it was decided to apply the infiltration method. Small assault groups, 20 to 30 fighters each, penetrated through German positions during the dark hours, bypassing fortified points. Uniting behind enemy lines, these groups created pockets of resistance, disrupting communications and causing panic. Particularly effective were night raids by reconnaissance and sabotage groups who mined roads, destroyed communication lines, and captured prisoners. Artillery duels took on a special character. German artillerymen used the tactic of roaming batteries. Guns constantly changed positions, firing several shots from one place and then quickly moving to a new firing point. This seriously complicated the task of counter-battery warfare for Soviet artillery. Soviet artillerymen responded with the rolling barrage method, sequentially shifting fire deep into the enemy's defense in front of advancing infantry, creating a moving wall of explosions. Tank units on both sides faced serious limitations. The swampy banks of the Isanz constrained the maneuver of heavy equipment, often leading to the loss of vehicles without direct enemy action. German Tigers, despite their powerful armament, proved too heavy for the rain-soaked soils. Soviet T-34s, lighter and more maneuverable, gained an advantage in these conditions, but they too often became easy prey for well-camouflaged anti-tank guns. The fourth day of the battle was marked by a new tactical maneuver by the German side: feigned retreat. Forward units simulated panic and retreated in disorder, luring Soviet units into pre-prepared fire sacks. Several infantry companies, carried away by the pursuit, were encircled and almost completely annihilated. The Soviet command learned a bitter lesson from this situation, introducing a strict rule: advancement only after thorough reconnaissance and artillery preparation. The tactics of sniper duels played a special role. Both sides actively used snipers not only to eliminate enemy command personnel, but also for psychological pressure. German snipers, armed with Mauser 98K optical rifles, could remain motionless for hours, waiting for a target. Soviet snipers, many of whom had received special training, operated in pairs. One observed, the other fired, which increased their effectiveness. By the fifth day of the battle, both sides were exhausted by continuous fighting. The front line had turned into a labyrinth of trenches, craters, and ruined fortifications. In these conditions, the role of engineering troops increased. German sappers created complex minefields with surprise elements, booby traps, surprise mines that activated when attempts were made to clear them. Soviet engineering units responded by creating passages using Bangalore torpedoes and special mine detectors. Dear Elsa, I'm writing to you between battles. I don't know if this letter will reach you, but I want you to know I'm alive and I think of you every minute. These lines were written by Obergefreiter Wilhelm Steiner on a crumpled piece of paper a few hours before his death. His body was found in a shell crater, and the letter, never sent, was kept by his comrade in arms. The human dimension of the Battle of Isanz is thousands of such stories, interrupted lives, unfulfilled hopes. Behind the dry figures of casualties and tactical schemes stood real people, German and Soviet soldiers caught in the meat grinder of battle. From the diary of Red Army Lieutenant Nikolai Sorokin. 7th day on this damned bridgehead. The water in the Isanz is red with blood. We sleep for 2 hours. The rest of the time is battle. Half the company is out of action. The boy recruits are holding up well, but there's terror in their eyes. Yesterday, Petrov, who had just arrived with the marching company, cried like a child after the battle. He had killed a man for the first time. I comforted him, though what can you say? The conditions in which soldiers of both armies found themselves were unbearable. July heat was replaced by torrential rains. Trenches filled with water, turning into mud baths. The wounded waited for hours for evacuation under incessant fire. There was a lack of drinking water, despite the proximity of the river. Approaches to it were swept by sniper fire. German Feldwebel Kurt Meyer recalled, "Our dugout was 50 meters from the bank. During the day, the temperature inside rose to 40 degrees. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and decomposition. We were going crazy with thirst, but anyone who tried to reach the river became a target. In a week of fighting, I lost 12 kilograms of weight. The wounded had an especially hard time. Medical battalions worked around the clock in tents and hastily equipped dugouts. There was a shortage of medicines, dressings, and blood for transfusions. Nurse Anna Kovaleva wrote in her diary, "Today we admitted 46 severely wounded. 3 died on the operating table. The surgeon's hands are shaking from fatigue, but they continue to work. I haven't slept for 3 days myself. I'm only holding on with coffee and despair." The psychological state of soldiers on both sides teetered on the brink of collapse. Incessant artillery shelling, constant fear, the death of comrades. All this led to combat psychological traumas, which were then called concussion or shell shock. German military psychiatrist Dr. Werner Hauser, who worked in a field hospital, noted in his report, 30% of incoming patients have no physical wounds but are completely unfit for combat. Typical symptoms: tremors of the limbs, mutism, amnesia, uncontrolled crying. Young soldiers of the last draft and veterans who have already experienced heavy battles find it particularly difficult to endure. The moral dilemmas faced by the participants in the battle exacerbated the psychological burden. German soldiers, many of whom already realized the futility of the war, were forced to continue fighting out of fear of court-martial and loyalty to their oath. Soviet soldiers, seeing the suffering of the local Polish population, found themselves choosing between obeying orders and human compassion. When the tanks and artillery of the world's 2 greatest armies clashed in a deadly struggle on the banks of the Isanka, simple Polish peasants found themselves at the epicenter of a bloody storm. The villages of Wysokoye, Sredni Brod, and Nizhnie Luki, which had stood on these lands for centuries, were reduced to ruins in a matter of days. Homes, built by generations of hands, were destroyed by artillery shelling or burned by retreating German units as part of a scorched earth tactic. Maria Kowalczyk, a 72-year-old resident of Wysokoye, recalled, "The evacuation of the civilian population was carried out by German authorities hastily and brutally. Those who failed to gather their belongings or refused to leave their homes were shot on the spot as partisans or saboteurs." Columns of refugees moved west along rain-soaked roads under incessant artillery fire. 10-year-old Tadeusz Wisniewski, one of the few surviving children of Sredni Brod, later recounted, "Not all residents left their homes. In the basements and cellars of the destroyed villages remained the elderly, the sick, those who could not or did not want to leave. They found themselves caught between 2 fires. German soldiers considered them potential enemy informants, while Soviet soldiers viewed them as possible fascist collaborators. The elderly priest from Nizhnie Luki, Father Andrei, refused to abandon his parish and the remaining parishioners. He set up a makeshift hospital in the church basement, where he provided assistance to the wounded from both sides. When Soviet troops entered the village, the battalion commander was astonished to find 20 wounded German soldiers and 15 Soviet soldiers in this shelter, whom the priest had saved from death. The destruction caused by the hostilities was catastrophic. According to post-war commission estimates, 80% of residential buildings, 95% of agricultural buildings, and all bridges and roads in the Isanka area were destroyed. The fields were pockmarked with shell craters, and the forests were burned by phosphorus bombs. A particular danger for residents returning after the fighting was minefields. Retreating German sappers laid thousands of anti-personnel mines, many with anti-handling devices. In the first months after the fighting ended, more than 300 civilians, attempting to return to their lands, died from mine explosions in the Isanka area. War correspondent Konstantin Simonov, who visited the battle area in August of '43, wrote, "It's hard to imagine that there was once life here. For tens of kilometers, only ashes, craters, and charred tree skeletons. It seems the very earth died here." But life gradually returned to these scarred lands. Already in the autumn of '43, the first families began to return to the destroyed villages. They lived in dugouts and hastily built barracks. They plowed with surviving horses or hitched themselves to the plow. Every day they found unexploded shells, bones of fallen soldiers and civilians in the ground. Anna Kowalska, who returned to Vysokoye with 3 children, recalled, "Our house was gone, just a hill of charred logs. We dug a dugout, covered it with branches. The children gathered mushrooms and berries in the forest. I traded canned goods from passing soldiers for embroidered towels, miraculously preserved in the bundle with which we fled." New communities gradually formed from the survivors. People united to rebuild homes together, cultivate the land, and care for orphans. In the absence of men, most of whom had died at the front or in camps, the main burden of reconstruction fell on the shoulders of women, the elderly, and teenagers. On July 17, 1943, the 6th day of the battle, the decisive moment of the confrontation arrived. It became clear that both sides had exhausted their initial strategic plans and were now looking for new ways to victory. The Soviet command, having analyzed the results of previous attempts to force the river, made a bold decision: a concentrated strike on a narrow section of the front, only 1.5 kilometers wide, in the bend of the river near Sredny Brod. At 2 in the morning, an artillery barrage of unprecedented power began. More than 200 guns and mortars rained tons of metal on German positions. The earth shook, the horizon blazed with fire. Major Walter Schultz, commander of a German artillery battalion, wrote in his diary, "It was a real firestorm. Communications were cut, observation posts destroyed. We were blinded and deafened by this hail of metal." At 4 in the morning, as the first rays of the sun illuminated the valley, the artillery shifted its fire deeper into the German defenses. At this moment, advanced assault groups in boats and rafts rushed across the river. Simultaneously, engineering units began to build pontoon bridges under the cover of smoke screens. The German command expected an attack, but not with such force and not in this location. Reserves concentrated on the flanks did not have time to regroup. By 6 in the morning, Soviet troops had captured a bridgehead 800 meters deep and a kilometer wide. Tanks were sent to the crossing, light T-70s and medium T-34s. General Dorn, realizing the danger of a breakthrough, threw his last reserve into a counterattack, a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers, reinforced by 5 Tigers. A fierce battle ensued in the wooded area near Hill 142. German tanks, superior to Soviet vehicles in firepower, burned 8 T-34s but could not stop the advance. Soviet infantry, infiltrating through the forest, attacked heavy German tanks from the flank and rear, using anti-tank grenades and Molotov cocktails. By noon, it became clear that the German defense was cracking. Lieutenant Colonel Heinz Müller, commander of the 128th Infantry Regiment, reported to division headquarters, "The situation is critical. Losses amount to 60% of personnel. Ammunition is running out. Request permission to withdraw to the second line of defense." General Dorn, understanding that it was impossible to hold the original positions, gave the order for an organized retreat to pre-prepared lines 3 kilometers west of the river. This maneuver allowed for the avoidance of encirclement of advanced units but opened the way for further Soviet offensive. In the afternoon, the weather changed again. Heavy clouds covered the sky, and a pouring rain began. The roads became muddy, which slowed the advance of Soviet equipment and supply convoys. German sappers used this respite to mine the paths of advance and construct engineering obstacles. By the evening of July 17th, the front line stabilized along the line of heights 142, 137, 129. Soviet troops consolidated their positions on the captured bridgehead, established supplies across pontoon crossings, and prepared for the development of the offensive. German units, exhausted by continuous fighting, fortified new defensive positions and awaited reinforcements promised by the command of Army Group Center. On July 18th, at 5 in the morning, Soviet troops resumed the offensive. The main blow was now aimed at the town of Isanz, with its important railway junction. Advanced units of the 185th Rifle Division, supported by 20 tanks, attacked Hill 137, a key point of the German defense. The German command, anticipating this maneuver, concentrated significant forces on the hill. 2 infantry battalions reinforced by artillery and mortars. A fierce battle ensued, in which both sides suffered heavy losses. 3 times Soviet assault groups climbed the hill, and 3 times they were repulsed by heavy fire. The decisive moment came around noon, when Soviet aviation, taking advantage of a clear spell, launched a massive strike on German positions. Il-2 attack aircraft, operating at extremely low altitudes, suppressed firing points and sowed panic among the defenders. Tanks and infantry rushed into the breach. By 1400 hours, Hill 137 was taken. The surviving German soldiers retreated to the town of Isanz, where the command hastily organized a new line of defense. But it was too late. Soviet tank units, having made a flanking maneuver from the north, cut off the road leading to the west. The German garrison found itself semi-encircled. The price of victory, paid by the participants in the Battle of Isanz, was measured not only in square kilometers of captured territory or strategic objectives. The main and most terrible measure was human lives. According to military archives, over 8 days of fighting, Soviet troops lost about 11,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. This amounted to almost a third of the initial strength of the attacking group. German losses were somewhat smaller in absolute numbers, about 8,600 soldiers and officers, but in percentage terms, they proved catastrophic. Over 40% of the personnel. Losses among command staff were particularly heavy. The Soviet Army lost 22 senior officers, including Colonel Nikolai Smirnov, commander of the 185th Rifle Division, who died during an artillery barrage on the 6th day of the battle. In German units, 37 officers ranked captain and above were put out of action, including 2 regimental commanders. Tank units suffered particularly heavy losses. The Soviet Army lost 64 tanks, 22 T-34s, 38 T-70s, and 4 heavy KV-1s. However, only 37 vehicles were destroyed by direct enemy action. The rest got stuck in marshy terrain or broke down due to technical malfunctions. German armored forces lost 29 units of equipment, including 7 Tigers, an irreplaceable loss for the Eastern Front. Material destruction in the combat zone was colossal. 3 villages, Vysokoye, Sredny Brod, and Nizhny Luki, ceased to exist as settlements. Out of 258 residential buildings, only 14 survived, and even those required major repairs. All 3 bridges across the Isanz were destroyed. The railway line passing through the battle area became unusable for 22 kilometers. Agricultural lands within a 10-kilometer radius of the battle's epicenter turned into a lunar landscape of craters, trenches, and anti-tank ditches. According to experts, it would take at least 5 years to restore the fertility of these lands, provided large-scale reclamation work was carried out. A special category of losses comprised civilian casualties. The exact number of deceased civilians could not be established even after the war. According to approximate calculations based on pre-war censuses and post-war registrations, between 400 and 600 civilians died in the combat area. Most of them were victims of artillery shelling and aerial bombardments. Analyzing the ratio of losses to achieved results, military historians arrive at ambiguous conclusions. On the one hand, Soviet troops accomplished their assigned task. They forced a water barrier, captured a bridgehead, and created conditions for a further offensive. On the other hand, the price of this success proved disproportionately high. Lieutenant General Zakharov, commander of the 47th Army, acknowledged in his report to the Stavka of the Supreme High Command. Personnel losses exceeded calculated figures by 2.5 times. The main reasons were an underestimation of the depth of German defenses and the difficulty of the terrain. The German command, analyzing the results of the battle, also came to contradictory conclusions. The tactical task of slowing the Soviet offensive was accomplished, but strategically, the battle became another step towards the inevitable retreat from Polish territory. A secret memorandum from Field Marshal Klug noted, "Losses in personnel and equipment are disproportionate to the results achieved. It is necessary to revise the concept of rigid defense in favor of more flexible solutions." The effectiveness of military decisions through the prism of their cost in human lives became the subject of thorough study in the post-war years. Soviet military theorists noted that the application of tactics of massive frontal assault after artillery preparation led to unjustifiably high losses. More successful were the methods of infiltration and flanking maneuvers applied in the last days of the battle. The Battle of Isanz left a deep imprint on the national memory of the Polish people. When the last shots faded and the troops left the ravaged lands, another battle began for the local inhabitants, the battle to preserve the memory of the tragedy that unfolded on their native soil. As early as '45, while the war was still ongoing, the first improvised memorial was created in the surviving school building in Wysoki. A wall with the names of fallen villagers written in charcoal on plaster. This was the first attempt to immortalize the memory of those who became innocent victims of a foreign war. In the post-war years, the attitude towards the Battle of Isanz in official Polish historiography was ambiguous. The communist authorities, dependent on Moscow, preferred to view these events solely as one episode of Poland's liberation by the Red Army. Any mention of civilian suffering or unjustified losses was subject to censorship. But popular memory preserved a different picture. In family legends, in songs, in quiet conversations behind closed doors, the Battle of Isanz appeared as a national tragedy, when Polish soil became an arena for the confrontation of two foreign armies, and the Polish people, its innocent victims. The Catholic Church played a special role in preserving memory. In the 50s, when official propaganda diligently formed the image of, quote, rural priests held secret memorial services for all victims of the battle, both military and civilian. In the Church of St. Stanislaus in Nowy Isanz, built on the site of a destroyed temple in Nizhnie Luki, the first memorial plaque appeared with a simple inscription. A real breakthrough in the memorialization of the battle occurred in the 60s, when Polish director Andrzej Wajda filmed a poignant drama about the fate of a peasant family caught between two fires. The film, which received international recognition, for the first time showed the world the human dimension of the tragedy. Vida masterfully avoided direct political evaluation, focusing on the fates of ordinary people, which allowed the film to pass censorship, but at the same time convey to viewers the truth about the suffering of the Polish people. Literature also contributed to the formation of national memory of the battle. Czesław Miłosz's novel The Valley of Isanz, awarded the Nobel Prize, became not just a work of art, but also an important historical document. Miłosz, who himself experienced the war, created a multi-layered narrative in which the fates of fictional characters intertwined with real historical events. Wisława Szymborska's poem, A Piercing Requiem for the Fallen, became a classic work studied in Polish schools. A true turning point in the official attitude towards the memory of the battle occurred after the political changes of the 80s. With the fall of the communist regime, archives were opened, and documents that had been kept secret for decades became accessible. Historians gained the opportunity to study previously forbidden topics: the scale of destruction, the fate of the civilian population, the actions of the Soviet military command. In the 90s, the National Memorial Complex was opened on the site of the former village of Sredny Brod. The central element of the composition was a bronze sculpture, silhouettes of a peasant family, frozen between two encroaching walls, symbolizing the opposing armies. A park with thousands of birch trees was laid out around the memorial, one for each known victim of the battle. Annually, on July 7th, on the anniversary of the battle's beginning, a national remembrance ceremony is held here, attended by the highest state officials. The Battle of Isanz was not just another military engagement. It became a kind of laboratory of military art, where theoretical concepts were tested with the blood and lives of soldiers. Military analysts on both sides carefully studied the experience of this battle, drawing lessons that subsequently changed approaches to warfare. For the Soviet command, the main discovery was the effectiveness of mobile defensive battles. The traditional doctrine of the Red Army relied on massive frontal attacks after artillery preparation. However, the experience of Isanz showed that such an approach led to unjustifiably high losses, especially when forcing water obstacles. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, analyzing the results of the battle, noted in his report to the Stavka, the tactics of infiltration and flanking maneuvers applied in the last days of the operation proved significantly more effective than frontal assaults. It is necessary to reconsider approaches to overcoming fortified lines. Soviet military theorists particularly highlighted the role of small assault groups, operating autonomously on narrow sections of the front. These units, well-trained and equipped, could penetrate German positions and create pockets of resistance in the enemy's rear. This approach required high initiative from junior commanders and rank-and-file soldiers, a quality that was traditionally not encouraged in the rigid military hierarchy of the Red Army. An important lesson was the interaction of different branches of service. At Isanz, for the first time, the effectiveness of coordinating infantry, tanks, artillery, and aviation in the conditions of forcing a water obstacle was fully demonstrated. Particularly valuable was the experience of using smoke screens to cover crossings and using dummy targets to divert enemy fire. For the German command, the Battle of Isanz also became a source of important tactical conclusions. The concept of elastic defense, first applied here on a full scale, proved its effectiveness. Instead of holding static positions, German units used maneuver, counterattacks, and pre-prepared lines for sequential withdrawal. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, noted in his analysis, "The experience of Isanz shows the need to transition from rigid positional defense to mobile actions. It is important not to hold every meter of ground, but to maintain the combat effectiveness of our units and inflict maximum damage on the enemy. German analysts paid special attention to the tactics of roaming batteries and the camouflage of artillery positions. In conditions of Soviet artillery superiority in numbers, it was maneuverability and stealth that allowed German batteries to effectively counter massive fire. An important lesson for both sides was the significance of engineering preparation of the terrain. German sappers demonstrated high skill in creating minefields with non-removable elements, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified firing points. Soviet engineering units, in turn, developed effective methods for rapid bridging under enemy fire. The post-war development of military science largely relied on the experience of such battles. In the Soviet Union, the tactics of forcing water obstacles, refined at Isanz, were included in the curricula of military academies. Special attention was paid to the psychological training of soldiers for operations under heavy fire resistance. In Germany, despite the defeat in the war, the experience of mobile defense was not forgotten. Many principles applied at Isanz subsequently became part of NATO military doctrine as effective methods of opposing a numerically superior enemy. The result of the Battle of Isanz was not only a change in the front line by several kilometers, but also the evolution of military thought. The bloody lessons of this battle, paid for with the lives of thousands of soldiers, formed the basis of modern concepts of warfare, where flexibility, initiative, and the interaction of various branches of service play a key role.